Good night to everyone.
Good night.
Our panel is named Democracy and Its Unconscious. I will present the members of our panel. My name is Marco Mauas, psychoanalyst, member of the New Lacanian School. And our guests are Perla Miglin, psychoanalyst, member also of the New Lacanian School, secretary of the JEP, Wardi, who works as a therapist and in Center Hans Akatan in Haifa. Our guest from Paris is Fabian Fajnwaks, who is a psychoanalyst at Paris and associate professor of the Department of Psychoanalysis in University of Paris 8, member of the École de la Cause Freudienne and the World Association of Psychoanalysis. And Khalil Sbeit, psychoanalyst, member of the New Lacanian School, member of the JEP, and founder of the Center Hans Akatan in Haifa. So our theme is democracy and its unconscious. I proposed this issue, this subject, because democracy has its unconscious. How do we know that? Because democracy has symptoms, has failures and symptoms. So we have to speak a little about those symptoms today in these not so easy days after the pandemic, which can be thought also as a symptom because, as you know, we don't know exactly what is the source of this virus, perhaps a laboratory, and the recent war here in Israel between Hamas and Israel. So I will proceed to read my paper, and each one of our members of the panel also will read his or her paper. And after that, we have some questions, a little discussion. My paper is titled, Where Does the Ball Fall When It Escapes from the Field of Play Through a Gap of Democracy? Freud needed to discover the death drive in order to locate and isolate this problem and at the same time separate its two aspects. In a soccer game, the interstices are regulated. It is known when it is a foul, a ball out, a penalty, an offside. For each of these eventualities, the referee, in the position of a judge, will know how to apply the regulations and the corresponding sanction. Before the crucial year 1920 of the death drive and its clinical and social consequences, the price to pay for a social symptom, that is, a failure of repression, that is, a failure of the strength of the father complex, to Freud was simply neurosis or religion, one structured like the other. Society is neurotic or religious. In case of not having solved the Oedipus complex, the result would be either one or the other. Either the shared hypocrisy about sex or the hypocrisy of religious sublimation. After 1920, things became more difficult, but also clearer. There is no legality that is clearly imposed in civilizing sport, since the end of the game is an integral part. It is included from the start in the game. There may be a desire to lose, not just the game, but to lose everything. Suicide, the compulsion to repeat, yearning for evil for oneself, the enjoyment in pain and suffering, and even the need for punishment or to continue in disease are a clinical fact and therefore, for Freud, also social. Punishment and sanction are not only not effective in order to bring order to the playing field, the playing field of language, as Wittgenstein would say, but punishment and sanction may be desirable in themselves. Bertrand Russell already mentioned in a long time ago about enjoying the possible destruction of war, but Freud transformed it into a transmissible concept. Far from lowering his arms in the face of this discovery, Freud redid the map of it, both for both of his psychoanalytical clinical work and of civilization. In his crucial text, Civilization and its Discontents, 1930, he confirms that neither the identifications and love ties of an inhibited goal, nor the force of law and punishment, methods of culture to prevent or inhibit inherent aggressiveness to the human being, they did not achieve their purpose. Of the communist system, he declares Freud as illusory the psychological premise according to which abolishing private property will solve the problem of aggression. And even more, he still notes how it's the neighboring communities that are harassed. I call it small difference narcissism, he says, but this doesn't clear things up. The universal love of Paul the Apostle, the foundation of the Christian community, resulted in the most brutal intolerance towards those left out. There are difficulties inherent in the essence of culture, he concludes, that no reform can save. This is Freud's impossibility theorem in relation to civilization and its discontents. And in democracy, the politics of the identities in question, there is a trauma, as Eric Laurent pointed out very clearly in a text in 2070. What could mean a subject of the Kingdom of Jordan or a Palestinian citizen or also born of an old Palestinian family, he lost much of his political weight, as can be seen in the fundamentals and results that Haaretz journalist Zvi Barel learned about the recent Hamas-Israel war. It all stemmed from the attempt to evict 23 Palestinian families from the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Those families and 5 others had been transferred there by the Jordanian government. The Absentee Property Act from 1950, Hok Nechase Nafkidim, is an emergency law that attempts to establish the status of people and property after the 1948 war. While the law does not specify Arabs or Jews, the interpretation of the law varied as expected according to the interpreter. Now, that neighborhood was named after Hussein al-Din al-Jahari, Saladin's personal physician, the Muslim leader who conquered Jerusalem from the Crusades in the 12th century. Although Jahara developed during the 19th century as a neighborhood outside the old city of Jerusalem, it gained an important status in terms of Palestinian national heritage because members of eminent and respected Palestinian families resided during the Mandate time as individuals like the Mufti, Amin al-Husayni, the mayor of Jerusalem, Al-Rajib al-Nashibi, the historian George Antonius, and the writer Isaac Nashasibi, who are first-rate symbols of Palestinian identity. In the same neighborhood is what considered the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik, a Jewish high priest from the era of the Central Temple of Jerusalem. This place was recognized as Jewish territory during Ottoman times, and the Arabs called it the Jewish site, Al-Yahuda. In the years that followed, there was legal acquisition by Jewish communities of the parcel of land. The French psychoanalyst Eric Laurent very clearly detailed the process in the previously cited text of the end of identity politics and the trauma that this implies. Let's return to the counterpoint with the article by Tzvi Barel in the Haaretz. The political campaigns of the in the USA that aimed to obtain the vote of identity communities did not give results. On the other hand, the shouts of Occupy, as in Paris, the Night of Food, were manifestations where it was not identity was at stake, but a politics of the body, of the present body. Tzvi Barel, for his part, draws the pragmatic conclusions from the latest confrontation between Israel and Hamas. Until that time, it was Jordan and the Palestinian Authority that held both symbolic and religious authority over the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem. When Hamas, the fundamentalist Muslim group in Gaza, responded with an attack on Israel to the evictions of Sheikh Jarrah, before Jordan or the Palestinian Authority reacted, in fact, it claimed with this movement practically sacrificial symbolic leadership. The bodies of believers are a factor of real weight among the identity failures of democracy. I stop here and I will invite our two ladies, colleagues, to follow. Please, perhaps Wardi or Perla. Perla? Do you hear me?
Wardi, open the audio.
Ah. Say maybe Perla wants.
Perla also, if you want.
Marco, you said.
Perla.
Okay, okay. Democracy today can be recognized where it is embodied. In 1977, I had the opportunity to witness in vivo the event that framed my aliyah in the country months before, the visit of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to the Knesset of Israel, on the occasion of being Menachem Begin in the function of the Prime Minister. Peace with Egypt embodied in a renewed desire for life in the act of each of the protagonists, was not without the desire for a democracy with the contingencies of the unconscious of its protagonist. The assassination of the Egyptian president testifies to a radical poison, this recurring temptation to deny a real. We constantly ask to debate about the relation of language and nation, people and territory, which comes from a national faith in the general process of laicization, issues that have disappeared behind the focus of the Judeo-Arab conflict, like George Ben-Sossan say as in the History of the Zionism book. In classic Greek, Solon, he began to embody it, the democracy. Despite its well-deserved fame, there is unanimity in considering Clisthenes as its founder. He called it isonomia, and Aristoteles called politeia, the pure form of popular government. The term itself combined demos and kratos, an expression with a certain brutal tone. The assessment we have to Athenian democracy is different from what the Athenians had. It was for them a questionable form. The time of Pericles in the century is often called the Golden Age. He was appointed strategist and was re-elected more than 20 years. Is there something that all the manuals avoid conveying, which was for Pericles the collect, the text of Homer, which is what he inscribed, but is nostalgia for not being a hero of Homer. In Seminar 6, The Desire and Its Interpretation, Lacan speaks as of Hamlet while deciphering his desire. He says, it's totally different to read Hamlet than to see him represent, the representation. How better illustrate the function of the unconscious that I call discourse of the other, that with the perspective that gives us an experience like that of the relationship between Hamlet and his audience. It is clear that the unconscious is presentified there in the form of the discourse of the other, the dimension that had the representation, that is, the one that the actors that represent Hamlet had, is strictly analogous to that by which we ourselves are interested in our own unconscious. The term democracy today used to designate a particular country, but is an abbreviation, like Raphael Simon, professor of linguistics at the University of Roma, told us. Even if it continues to claim democracy, understood naturally as liberal democracy, that is to say representative of its values, of its virtues, and its merits, for at least 10 years, is subject in many places of the West, is an object of numerous manifestations of impatience, of a severe criticism, and even of a rejection. Speaks to me what Simon says, democracy as a political method, as a regime rests on bold fictions that must be regarded as true fictions. I refer to his work published in the journal Le Débat in 2014. Also, I refer you to the article by George Ben-Sossan, Jewish Juifs de l'Orient arabe, l'effort pour ne pas voir in the same journal Le Débat. Is there a leader who pass an analysis? Would he be able to deal with the fact that if there is something we call universal, is that what failed for each one? And how to put the cards of truth in play, those that should anticipate the adversary as the close friend of the radical nature of the other, while it does not exist, that most difficult to reach. To leads me to confront myself in this day so critical for the Israeli citizens, which an unis when listening to the resort to sowing fair, to call it the advent of the new government that was created, a left-wing government, in that to input a being, to classify, to evaluate, to diagnostic, to fix it in a universal destiny, the left and the right stuck us by using their sense not renewed by the creative power of the language that would give them the sense of the social symptom that disturb them. It occurs with the symptom of sowing hatred, reject the advent of a new use that the new configuration of the government will make come. In reality, the diagnosis of the deficit left-wing government is nominalist in that it diverts us with the representation of a common sense and thus attentive to a satisfactory use of a singular enjoyment. En Actualité de la haine, en perspective psychoanalytique, Anaël Lebovici-Quesnay said, to be satisfied with its singularity, which presupposes, first of all, to hold it, this is a position which alone prohibits any pretension to the standardization of speaking bodies, which is rooted in the most common racism. This is therefore an ethical position that promotes the absolute difference to make use it, where hatred dream of world without difference. In Georges Bensosan, Un Histoire du Sionisme, we can read the fall of peace. To create the state supposed to invent the nation, in other words, to proceed against all the nationalism for which the nation is at the base of the state. Secular Zionism needs to break with religion, or at least move away from it. The concern for the state being by definition a secular concern. But without nation, there is not state, and without the religion substratum, the Jewish national fact remains abstractly empty. This is another major contradiction that Zionism faces here to the Enlightenment and the nation state. Optimistic in this way, he participates at the same time in the anti-Enlightenment current through the foreknowledge of what man is capable of doing, not to his fellow man, but we already know, but to himself. The adventure of Zionism also lies in this teaching, at the end of which power lies in the common action of men. To live is to live together. It suggests quietly to share a political effort, in this case a national struggle that humanizes the world because, like all politics, it is a shared world. Zionism not only reconciled the Jew with himself by projecting him into political action, it also reconciled him with the world. This is the ultimate meaning of the political autonomy sought by all Zionist schools of thought, the desire not to be spoken anymore, but finally to speak.
Thank you, Perla. We will ask to Wardi, please, Wardi, your intervention.
Democracy and its fractured truth. Perla and Marco's proposal to me to take part in this philosophy night with the title.
We don't hear you. Wardi?
Ken, now okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I was muted. So Perla and Marco's proposal to me to take part in this philosophy night with the title of The Future of Democracy and the specific title of the table, Democracy and Its Unconscious, came on the same night that my eldest son, 17.5 years old, decided to take part in the demonstrations in Haifa as a protest against what he called the unfairness of what the Jews are doing to the Arabs in Sheikh Jarrah. While I was trying to convince him to change his mind, I asked him maybe he could find alternative ways to pass his voice, more civilized ones. He answered me, "Mom, it's a democratic action." Okay. At the next morning, I answered yes for participating in this night, though I had no idea about what would I say. I relied on the knowledge that I don't have, with 3 signifiers stuck in my mind: future, democracy, and the unconscious. In parallel, I've encountered, maybe by chance or perhaps not, Freud's text, Thoughts for Times of War and Death, which he wrote in 1915, few months after the outbreak of the First World War. I say perhaps not by chance, because it happened during the period of May events that broke out in the country, in which Arab and Jew citizens attacked each other on the basis of a racial affiliation, in parallel to the war in Gaza. And my neighborhood was one of the attacked places, a thing that left a significant impact on me. Though the distress, pain, and disappointment, I couldn't be surprised. After all, in the era of the inexistent other, and with the new knowledge from my analytic experience, in which I face the devil inside me, I get to know that the world can't be divided into good and bad, angels and demons, truth and lie. Since the truth is fatally divided, as Jacqueline Miller says in Milanese Intuitions in 2002. These pairs of opposites imply the inhibition of the primitive impulses directed towards other aims and fields, altering their objects. And beyond despair, I couldn't continue to be passive and started a search for explanations and consolation. Through talking, reading, writing, and correspondence with people. Kind of passage à l'acte, a speech act, And while reading the fascinating text I've mentioned before, I was struck with a paragraph and would like to read it here with you. I'll try to share the text. They gave me an opportunity to do that. No, here. Okay. Civilized society, which demands good conduct and doesn't trouble itself about the instinctual basis of this conduct, has thus won over to obedience a great many people who are not in their own natures. The pressure of civilization can be shown in malformations of character and in the perpetual readiness of the inhibited instincts to break through to satisfaction at any suitable opportunity. Anyone thus compelled to act continually in accordance with precepts which are not the expression of his instinctual inclinations is living, psychologically or psychoanalytically speaking, beyond his means and may objectively be described as a hypocrite. Whether he is clearly aware of the incongruity or not. It is undeniable that our contemporary civilization favors the production of this form of hypocrisy to an extraordinary extent. One might venture to say that it is built up on such hypocrisy and that it would have to submit to far-reaching modifications if people were to undertake to live in accordance with psychological truth. Thus, there are very many more cultural hypocrites than truly civilized men. Indeed, it is a debatable point whether a certain degree of cultural hypocrisy isn't indispensable for the maintenance of civilization, because the susceptibility to culture, which has hitherto been organized in the minds of present-day men, would perhaps not prove sufficient for the task. We may already derive one consolation from this discussion, says Freud. Our mortification and our painful disillusionment on account of the uncivilized behavior of our fellow citizens of the world during this war were unjustified. They were based on an illusion to which we had given away. In reality, our fellow citizens haven't sunk so low as we feared, because they had never risen so high as we believed. The fact that the collective individuals of mankind, the peoples and the states, mutually abrogated their moral restraints naturally prompt these individual citizens to withdraw for a while from the constant pressure of civilization and to grant a temporary satisfaction to the instincts which they had been holding in check. The primitive soul is the fullest meaning of the word, in the fullest meaning of the word, imperishable. I will continue with my text, please. Okay. And if I go back to democracy, I think about it as an illusion, which we needed desperately in order to have a good image or idea about ourselves. A beautiful lie, but unfortunately, the instinct is not democratic. Going back to Freud's text, in criticism of the disappointment of the uncivilized man acting at time of war, he says, strictly speaking, it is not justified, for it consists in the destruction of an illusion. We welcome illusions because they spare us unpleasurable feelings and enable us to enjoy satisfaction instead. We must not complain then if now and again they come into collision with some portion of reality and are shattered against it. And at the end, if trying to be optimistic, I think that paving the way, as Freud says, in each new generation for a more far-reaching transformation of instinct shall be the vehicle of a better civilization, even if still on a dubious basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Wardi. And please, Fabian.
Thank you, Marco. I will speak about the one and the many in democracy. I was very interested in the title of this table, Democracy and its Unconscious, proposed by Marco Mauas. It suggests that, like a subject, democracy would have, perhaps, an unconscious. Jacques Lacan once said that the unconscious is politics, which is not exactly the same thing, because the principle of this proposal of Jacques Lacan is that the unconscious is at the very origin of the social link that politics establishes. The proposal of this table makes a jump between the register of the subject and the social register of democracy. This could seem like an extrapolation, if it were not for the fact that Freud himself, at the beginning of his Massenpsychology, emphasizes that the social is nothing other than the extension of the subjective. The unconscious of democracy sounds like the famous sentence that the Spanish painter Goya wrote under one of his drawings: "The sleep of reason breeds monsters." I don't know exactly if there is an unconscious of democracy, but it certainly has symptoms, as Marco was telling in the beginning of this table. Some of them have been reported lately in France, at least, and in some of the great Western democracies. Crisis of representativeness, drift towards autocracy and towards what has been erroneously called illiberal democracy, corruption of the judicial system and political co-option of judges, criminalization and repression of protest. These shifts are each certainly symptoms of different things, and each would merit at last a lecture. It is not certain, and at the risk of provocation, that the unconscious, such as analysis formulates it, knows and is flexible to democratic functioning. The unconscious, structured like a language, supposes the permanent signification of one signifier by another, and the primacy of a signifier that Lacan qualified as the master signifier. This work of deciphering does not know any argumentative or contradictory debate as in political meetings, nor does it know any diversity. It is therefore not certain at all that unconscious is compatible with democracy, where tolerance of diversity and minorities prevails over authoritarianism and autocracy. This doesn't mean at all that psychoanalysis defends this type of government, because it really needs a democratic and rather liberal economic system to function. The history of psychoanalysis in the socialist countries of the 20th century has demonstrated this very well. As I was listening to Perla's talk, I thought that perhaps the distinction between state and nation that she introduced might correspond to the classical distinction that Hegel makes between state and civil society. the state as a guarantee, as a legal framework and background where civil society finds its place. Society presents variations of forms that change throughout time and that question each time the model of the state in effect. An intrinsic tension thus exists between the state and the civil society, which can take various forms and which we could classify on the side of the negative, which works in the interior of each democracy by producing some of its symptoms. The nation, as a name for civil society, imposes permanent and dialectical modifications on the concept of state. And it is this movement that we have seen in recent years in Israeli politics. This is a worldwide shift in identity from which we cannot see why Israeli society should remain unaffected. With certain characteristics of its own, of course, which must be properly situated in order not to fall into erroneous and crude approximations. In Israel, the multi-party system and government coalitions practiced for decades particularly limit any drift towards the installation of an autocracy. Judicial independence free of political constraints exists, as do inalienable constitutional rights and a free press. Despite what journalists and political analysts here in France at least have written in recent years, democracy in Israel has a dynamism that prevents a drift towards what is misnamed illiberal democracies. An article in Haaretz on March 22nd by Alon Pinkas rightly pointed out why, for all these reasons, Israel cannot be classified as an illiberal democracy beyond the fact that this term implies a contradiction in terms, in fact. This was seen once again with the latest alliance between Bennett and Lapid. Unlike the United States, where two major parties alternate in power, having to negotiate each time with a majority in both legislative chambers, in Israel it is the small parties that balance the democratic game in the game of alliances. Political analysts point to the end of the 70s with the victory of Menachem Begin and Likud and the alliances with the still small parties of the religious right as the beginning of an identity-based drift that seems to restrict more and more the broad project with which Israel was created. Certainly, the first and second intifadas have passed by. The peace with Jordan II, the Oslo Accords, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the departure of Tzahal occupation of Gaza in 2005 without any prior agreement, and the rise of Hamas since then in the Strip of Gaza. The scuffles between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, which accompanied the latest Hamas rocket attacks, are a clear example of this rift in Israeli society, which has existed for some years now, and which will take a long time, a very long time, to be mended. It is certainly a symptom of what is at work in the heart of civil society against the project of a state tolerant of diversity. The promotion of the Israeli law, nation state of the Jewish people, law adopted by the Knesset in 2018, was probably already an indicator of this identitarian drift. Although it recalled some of the basic laws of the state, it also contained other more sensitive elements, such as the definition of Jerusalem as the complete and unified capital of Israel, the downgrading of the Arabic language, which was until then the second language of the state, making Hebrew the only state language, and the encouragement as a national value, the development of Jewish communities, which may jeopardize the status of the Arab and Druze minority communities in Israel. There is thus a tension between the one and the many that certainly works on democracy as an essentially plural mode of government. This tension produces a push towards the one of non-differentiation that threatens the plural spirit of democracy. It is called an autocratic and authoritarian drift in current democracies. It is perhaps this push toward the one that Marco proposed to name under the form of the unconscious of democracy. A pluribus unum, from many one, is the term that the independent North American colonies of England adopted in 1776 to name the project of the melting pot, where all free men were going to merge, that the founding fathers wanted for America. The European Union adopted the motto in varietate concordia, unity in diversity, in 2000, closer, in fact, to the project of the Israeli civil society. And here is my question. Will this exceptional state that is Israel in the concert of countries in the world also lead it to find inwardly in its civil society a form that is exceptional in maintaining a diverse and plural project against the forces that draw it towards the one of national identity? In this case, and only in this case, it will have found a know-how with its unconscious. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabian, very much. Please, Khalil, will follow. And if we have time, we will take a short discussion.
I hope that the time can give me the opportunity to complete my speech. So I will start to present. I already have a lot of questions to discuss with the others, but I will start with my speech right now. Israeli democracy and its unconscious. Marco and Perla's request to participate in this table occurred during the terrible days we all experienced last May. You hear me? It's okay? Yeah. Just a minute. Okay. Days in which cannons roared and wars lost of their value due to those terrible sights that we all witnessed, an outbreak of war and violent conflicts between Jews and Arabs in the country, events of unrestrained violence by groups from both sides that imposed their mastery over the public domain. With the distress that I felt and a sense of threat due to the abyss toward which our lives here might plunge, I replied yes, yes to my colleagues' request, colleagues with which I share an interest that crosses from my perspective all divisions relying on our origins and the background that the contingent destined to each and every one of us to be born into. An interest in the field of psychoanalysis, a field of exile from the mass and the universal, a field of alienation to ourselves, which is at the core of the most intimate experience of each and every one of us in meeting with the stranger within, with the unconscious. At first, the title that Marco offered for this evening seemed to me enigmatic and strange. It posited a question for me regarding how to approach it. How can you discuss the unconscious and relate it to democracy, a model of social political organization regarding civil life, whereas discussing the unconscious is usually about the experience and the life of a single person. I found a direction that made this title accessible by reading Miller's courageous act in his presentation of the Turin theory during the establishment of the Italian School of Psychoanalysis. In this presentation, and not without some worries that stones were going to be thrown at him, he proposed the theory of a subject of this school. He proposed an existence of the unconscious regarding the school, an unconscious that is instilled in this collective form called school, an unconscious that is composed of individuals or the subjective loneliness of subjects who partake in the school and are members of it. Miller designed this development starting with Lacan's reading of Freud's group psychology, which teach us that the collective is nothing but the subject of the individual. In Miller's concise reading of group psychology, he provided a logic to the collective form of the school that is different from the logic at the base of the psychology of the group that Freud analyzes in his book, in which the collective is composed of multiplicity of individuals that take as their ego ideal the same object, an ideal that is posited as the common denominator of the ego of a number of individuals. As we learn from Freud, the group is made of emotional ties through identification in two axes. The vertical that relates to the ideal that connects the members through the ties of the individuals to the ideal, and the horizontal that relates to the connection of group members through the belief that we are all equal, that we are all brothers. Psychoanalysis is the field of strangeness and alienation in relation to the ideal. It is a field of a cause that aims at the absolute difference of the individual from others, the field of the loneliness of those who do not have a group. This is where Miller proposed the paradoxical logic of the school as a field of a group of those who do not have a group, of different subjective lonelinesses, with the alienation of each and every one of them from the ideal. Just a minute, please. In a group based on a logic such as this, the connection between the members and the difference between them, it's a connection that is based on multiplicity and do not on the similarity between members. Their attachment their attachment to the one or their identification with it. National groups are constructed according to the model of the group psychology due to identification with the mutual ideal. And so is the case with Israel. According to the Zionist ideal, the state that was supposed to be was intended to populate the diaspora of the Jewish people along with its multiplicity of cultures, languages, and differences, as all fall under the national ideal of a Jewish state. This ideal of a Jewish state who embraced a democratic order to organize its civil life has many issues with great tension that are not easy to untangle, as Fabian recommend about that. Symptomatic in a special way and on the dimension of the impossible to untangle, that of the attempt to include under the same ideal the Palestinian Arab population in Israel. I shall focus on this specific point on the impossible of the Israeli democracy, since it relates to me personally, and since my life is interweaved with the Israeli domain, as long as it continues to be so, and thus it's affected by the consequences of this political situation. It's possible to see the outbreak of the latest events as an expression of this impossibility of tension that exists between the state as a Jewish state and its democracy. The National Palestinian Group in Israel, which historically belongs to the Palestinian people, obviously cannot and will not be included under the Jewish signifier of the state, and due to the definition of the state as Jewish, obviously the democratic signifier cannot be valid for it. The very definition of the state as Jewish excludes it from the collective and naturally discriminate it as a civil group by providing superiority and priority to he who is defined as Jewish in comparison with he who is not Jewish, a priority to everyone who falls under this name in comparison to everyone who doesn't or cannot be subjected to this group and its ideal. The nation-state law provides a legal validity to this aspect of discrimination and superiority by providing...
Khalil,
yes?
Khalil, you have 1 minute, 53 seconds.
Okay, I cannot complete.
So,
okay.
I tell you this because not to be cut in the middle by the guillotine, they told us.
Okay, I don't know what to do, but because I don't know.
Just a conclusion, Khalil.
Conclusion.
Yes, the conclusion, and perhaps
I can say that yeah, as a symptom, this problematic problem can create a symptom that we can attend it with psychoanalysis, not through the war and through the ways of trying to beat the other and maybe defeating it. And from the side of psychoanalysis, we can attend this problem with an ethic that doesn't try to fix the symptom, but to try to do with
the symptom.
To acknowledge maybe and to to come to reconciliation, yeah, with the existence of it, with its complexity, and to try to do with the jouissance, yeah, and from this aspect we can take a line to treat and maybe to deal with the complexity of the political life in Israel, not through trying to win the game from one side, but to go to reconciliation with the existence of the other, with his difference. So this is what I had to say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, you all. Thank you, Perla. Thank you, Wardi. Thank you very much, Fabian, our guest from Paris.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you.